Hi, this is Greg Gremke. I work with economic thinking and do workshops and online resources on the economics of debate topics. So for the NCFCA League, there's three proposed topics or resolutions. One involves European Union immigration policy, and two others involve humanitarian and development aid. Humanitarian for sub-Saharan Africa, development for three Central American countries, which is part of the domain of or the field of development economics. So economists research what sort of policies help countries develop and which sort of programs don't. There's a debate over foreign aid. Critics say it should be called foreign hindrance because it often hurts, but that's what debaters can look at, which policies or reforms might be most effective, and then of course we'll be researching the other side. I looked at the Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala topic on development aid, and at the Africa topic on sub-Saharan humanitarian aid. Also, by the way, these are both related to the immigration topic because U.S. turmoil with immigration is in the recent years has to do with refugee caravans coming through Mexico to the United States, either coming from Honduras and Guatemala especially. This has to do with the poverty there and the violence and sort of the question. I mean, it's one thing to be poor in the 1850s or the 1950s, but how can this be the case in 2020? How can these countries still be dysfunctional? And so that has a lot to do with problems of governance, and that's what development economists explore. Why is Costa Rica, for example, better and safer than Honduras or El Salvador? What makes some places succeed and others don't? Similarly, in development economics, the countries of Southeast Asia and Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, these are the Asian tigers in the 1950s. They were all poorer. People there were poorer than all the people in Latin America. Somehow, between the 1950s and the 1990s, the Southeast Asian or the Asian countries took off, and Latin American countries stagnated or got poorer. Populations exploded. What helps explain those changes? And that's what we explore in a discussion of economics for these related to the topics. In this presentation, I'm going to talk some about labor mobility. Also in this is an NCFCA LD topic saying immigration is a human right. Well, this is a claim on freedom to move. Should people have the freedom to leave places that are impoverished and dangerous and go to a place that's safer, where they have a better chance for prosperity and human flourishing? And one way to get around these issues and labor mobility, for example, if you wanted to help El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the biggest help in those countries today for the people in those countries is to let them go from their country to a place that's safer and where they can earn more income, to Canada or the United States or to Europe. That idea of labor mobility, that someone in Guatemala could fly to the U.S., work for a week, and fly home, or Mexican agricultural workers used to come up to California and Washington, Oregon, and pick in the fruit and vegetable industry, and then they'd go back to Mexico. So that idea of labor mobility or a work visa would be one way economists argue it's the way to bring the fastest prosperity to poor countries. Similarly, in sub-Saharan Africa, if people could come to Europe and work and go back if they want to, that idea of a work visa is sort of an alternative to immigration. Immigration, we have political concerns of people coming, being citizens, and one thing and another. But so the discussion of labor mobility versus immigration are part of the same story. Lots of people very poor in dysfunctional countries. They want to come to wealthy countries. Should they be free to do that, or what limitations or what sort of policy should be involved? So I'm going to cover the issues I just mentioned, and then we're going to look at some sort of other issues. What's the best way to bring prosperity to Honduras? One proposal by Paul Romer, who was head of the World Bank, was a charter city. Allow a mini Hong Kong to be developed in Honduras. And this was proposed, it was approved by the Honduran legislature, it was going to be backed by the legal institutions of Canada, and you would have been able to build factories, airports, ports, build prosperity rapidly, and it wouldn't be forcing any sort of foreign system on Honduras. People could choose to enter the charter city and work or not. So the idea of having an enclave or a chartered area is one path to prosperity. The Charter Cities Institute works on this. The way to get better governance, they say, is to have charter cities within countries. You might say, well, that sounds sort of crazy. Well, it's not. The wealthiest places in the world are charter cities. That's Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, Andorra, places and other cities, charter cities in Europe, Liechtenstein, Monaco. These are cities that have their own legal systems, historically embedded within a larger country. And it turns out that's how Europe got wealthy. That's how the ancient Greeks lived and prospered. So there's a long history of city independence as an alternative to nation states that's relevant for development economics. It's not the whole answer, it's not everything, but it's one proposal that's being considered by development economists in Africa as new charter cities are being proposed and developed, and in Latin America. So I have a presentation on sort of the history of this I've given for some years on nation-state cities and charter cities. This is part of European history, the history of the Hanseatic League. It's a fascinating story, and it's relevant for these various topics. Looking at trade in the ancient world, trade between cities, the role of transportation, and medieval times, trade between Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League cities of the north. You think, well, gosh, I've never heard of this stuff. Well, it's worth hearing of. So the story of the Hanseatic League, it's not just ancient history. The Hanseatic League is, in a sense, active today in the northern European countries that are pushing for reforms to make Europe more prosperous. So that's in the news. Also, this wonderful article in the Atlantic, which is sort of telling the story of how the Hanseatic League developed and what lessons that has for development today. So I'll try to come back to that as we go through this presentation. And I should be able to do it in 4 minutes, but I'm old and slow. Okay, that should cover up. So this is the sort of overview here. Now, we had a freedom to move topic that was an LD topic in the University Interscholastic League, and some of the links or materials are still online. That's related to the current or the proposed NCFCA topic, and also it's proposed to Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico should, the economists, some call for open borders, and that drives people nuts. You think of millions of people would flood into the U.S. Well, you saw in the earlier presentation about when England opened up to the poor countries of Eastern Europe. It turns out it wasn't a flood, it was limited. But again, that's a ethical issue and a controversial political issue for these topics in Europe and America. Helping these poor areas get rich sort of automatically solves the challenge of illegal immigration. So we have materials online, study guides, the economic engagement one with Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela is a resource on development economics and the role of the U.S. sort of being transformed by immigration. And this is from an article that was in the Wall Street Journal, but from 1980 to 2007, we had 10 million people migrated legally and illegally from Mexico. That's a huge influx. When Ronald Reagan was governor of California, it was like 10% Anglo. Now, 10% immigrant, 90% Anglo. So Texas, southern states, California were transformed by the Mexican immigration, which came because the demographics, lots and lots of people in their 20s and 30s, that's when people move, who came into the U.S. So now some 12 million Mexican-born people are in the U.S., their children, it's 10% of the U.S. population. And not only people from Mexico, but people from other Central American countries come. And so part of the increased migration from these countries follows from the Mexican immigration to the U.S. Now, again, the topic under consideration is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, but part of the story is these people are following friends and relatives that have come into the U.S. over the last 20, 30 years. There's a broader picture. The biggest story in the world is migration. All around the world, hundreds of millions of people are migrating to cities and the suburbs around cities. This is where the jobs are, the factories are, where electricity and sanitation is. So a rival city is the story of 200 million people in China have migrated to the cities illegally because you have to get permits in China. So that floating population is a huge part of China's reality in China. Triumph of the City talks about the migration to cities around the world, Lagos, Nigeria, Nairobi, Kenya. Millions and millions of people are migrating to shanty towns around cities because there's more opportunities there than there is in the country. And the same in India, people migrating to Mumbai and other cities in India. Borderless Economics by Robert Guest talks about how development came through these immigrants, right? The Chinese sea turtles, the Chinese who had left to become prosperous in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the US, they're the ones that drove economic development in China as they came back to their villages, invested, and brought expertise back. The same in India. It was the Indians who'd left to work in Silicon Valley and England. They went back and brought capital back, and that was a big part of economic development. So the people who will make Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador prosperous are the people from those countries who've come to the United States, who've prospered, who are in businesses, who begin investing back in the countries they came from. This back and forth is a big part of how development works with trade between countries, capital investment between countries, and the movement of people. So these are 3 books that I recommend, and you can read about them online at Amazon. Also, I recommend for this topic Hernando de Soto, Peruvian economist who writes on globalization. This is streams free on Free to Choose Network, the globalization, and just watch the first 7 minutes of globalization at the crossroads. Or maybe, watch the whole thing, but at least the beginning. And what he's explaining is that in America through the 1800s, in Japan, millions of people migrate to the cities. They leave the farms. There's jobs and factories in the cities. And our globalized economy came in part from this earlier migration that we experienced. And that's what's been happening in India, China, Latin America in recent decades. People migrating to the city. And then they are in developing countries, the cities lack the legal institutions that allow these people to prosper. So poor people in Cairo, for example, or poor people in Lagos, they don't have access to the legal system. The property rights network that we take for granted, to start a company, to get title to your home, to borrow money, you generally can't get that in most parts of the world. It's way too complicated. So the formalizing the legal system, allowing poor people access to the law, that would be the strongest affirmative possible, I would argue, for the humanitarian aid, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the development aid. How do we help people get access to the legal system? And you can read more about that in Hernando de Soto's books and articles and learn more in his videos as those are presented. It's again, powerful, valuable background for students. So I mentioned the caravan here. We've got a migrant caravan coming to the U.S. In, I think, October, last October, maybe the October before. Hondurans coming to the U.S. And here's an article in the Atlantic saying, look, if you want to solve the problem of development in Honduras, put a charter city there. That's what Paul Romer, a Stanford economist, and again, former head of the World Bank, argues. You can read more about that. So this is the Romer Charter City claim by it's on Twitter. And then here is the article. So this author, I think, is the head now of the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank in New York. And he said, look, the Honduran government considered setting up a charter city. Migrants could go to a charter city right there in Honduras and get all the opportunities they would get coming into the U.S. and more. So the government tried to do this, considered doing this. Romer and others were proposing it, and it was a cool idea in a lot of ways. Critics said, no, this is colonialism. This is, problematic in various reasons. But this idea of charter city is to try and get the same success that we had with Hong Kong. Again, Hong Kong was a sort of forgotten British-ruled area where the legal system had limited government, low tariffs, low taxes, and it allowed open migration from China. People came in huge numbers and became prosperous. Shenzhen and China's economic development actually followed, emulated trying to make more Hong Kongs inside China. And now Shenzhen is one of the most dynamic cities in the world. So special economic zones or charter cities, this would be a way to jumpstart development in sub-Saharan Africa and in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Now, this is an article in Foreign Affairs, which is a sort of mainstream foreign affairs article, and it, maybe sounds radical, but it's arguing that, what we had before World War I, which were open borders, you could pretty much go anywhere you want, and the argument is you were to relax migration. And again, you focus, you have your police power focusing on terrorism, contagious diseases, criminals, but not on stopping people that, want to pick lettuce or want to be roofers or want to do everyday work that is generally beneficial. Borders still exist. Nobody's saying getting rid of borders. Well, except the title of the article. But what they're actually saying is borders are legal distinctions, jurisdictional boundaries. So when someone comes to the U.S., they're under U.S. law. But rather than, it's like protectionism is stopping products from crossing borders, right? Stopping, cars and other things. They hit a barrier at the border. Well, free trade people say, no, we want open trade. We want goods and services to go around the world. Why not people? Well, the history of that is fascinating. And that's why I encourage this article, again, from a mainstream publication. It might sound radical, but it's not. It's just standard ideas that were popular all throughout the world until the eugenics movement in the U.S. pushed to stop, low intelligence immigrants that they claimed were, and then the shutdown in World War I. So again, a resource on the topic, on all the topics. The argument, it was increase liberty, it would end global poverty. Again, think about all the complaints. The complaints are, well, too much use of welfare, terrorism, infectious disease, murder. Well, again, you focus your police power on those things and you let people work. There is no limit to the number of jobs. Immigrants create jobs. You could say, well, wait, if I'm a roofer, how am I going to compete with all these immigrants that are roofers? The evidence from South America is that those roofers became managers. They managed people with lower language, less language skills, and so forth. So you tend to have low-income people boosted by increased immigration. Again, this is just the economic data. It's not a normative claim. So this, again, more on this. The argument is this is a normal thing. These racial 1924 things that were based on race, keeping out Jewish people, keeping out people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and so forth. Okay, fascinating area, I would argue. So here's another one. Would poverty be eliminated? The argument is it would double GDP, would make people far more prosperous. So again, you can read more about that. I also have in my presentations a lot of the arguments of people who are against increased immigration, who want immigration reduced a lot. Various people in the Trump administration are very much against, very much for protectionism and for reducing immigration, arguing that it's a bad thing and it would help America to have less imported products and less foreign people here. Those are positions worthy of understanding and making sense of. This is the Center for Global Development, I believe, is at New York University. And again, this is focusing on labor mobility. We've got this gridlock where people can't get to where the jobs are. It would be like stopping people from Michigan from moving to Texas. When Texas is booming and Michigan is in recession, it's natural for people to go where the jobs are. And again, more on this, more stories. I mentioned before the tech industry is based, a lot of it is immigrants with PayPal, eBay, Sun Microsystems, and so forth, Google. And again, it's a recent thing. Human history, the history of movement, migration tends to promote diffusion of ideas. And, we see that in restaurants that are similar. We have different kinds of food. Some stuff we don't like, some stuff we do, but you don't have to have the new food. You can eat the old food. Similarly, in technology and industry, immigrants tend to bring new ideas, or the movement of people. So this is a bit of the history that's in closed borders. Supporters of free trade say the flow of goods regulates itself. Defenders of free movement say that you get a natural balance. So when Mexico's population was expanding dramatically, the demographics, and their government had nationalized the banks and impoverished the country, people naturally left. Now, if the U.S. follows policies that makes us poor, people will leave and go to Mexico and other places. You have an interesting story of when Colombia had a more left-wing government and drug wars and all sorts of battles and conflicts. Huge numbers of people left Colombia and went to Venezuela that was stable and prosperous, and they lived with family, stayed with relatives. That went on for decades. Then Colombia had economic reforms, had more market-oriented leaders. They were able to stop the illegal drug battles and so forth, the terrorists. But Venezuela came under socialist rule with Maduro, and the country became impoverished. And now hundreds of thousands of people have left Venezuela to go to Colombia. And sometimes they're staying with the same families that used to stay with them decades earlier. So this movement of people allows people to escape bad government and bad weather, bad governance. And the argument is there's no planners or leaders that can know these things. These are the decisions of everyday people looking at their opportunities and finding things, just like the immigrants that came to America. Farmland was small in Germany, and there was a high, people had a lot of kids, population grew rapidly, so people left and came to the U.S. That meant the farms could get larger and more productive in Germany, and we had more labor to go with the huge amount of land in the U.S. So that's what happens with migration. People move to where there's better opportunities, and in many ways they make things better off by leaving the countries where they were poor. Although that's brain drain and various debates